There's no surprise today we're living in a rather complicated world, and given the fact that politics is getting more sophisticated and the economy is getting more uncertain. Now, when we look at around the world, especially we look at international crises, on one hand, it's rather surprising that we're still asking the question, is the war the solution to the problems? But on the other hand, how do we understand the concept of nationalism? If we follow geopolitical change, now today across the continent, many leaders around the world have claimed that they're gearing the nation towards nationalism. But from the historical perspective, that things can be different, or in the past, that things might not be as easy as we thought. So that's why today, when we look at the geopolitical change, it's critical and crucial that we need to talk about those historical events and also truly understand the relationship between what's happened in the past and also what's happening today. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Dr. Eric Storm. Dr. Storm is a specialist in Spanish history of the 19th and 20th century. He also conducted extensive research into the construction of regional identities in France, Spain, and Germany between 1890 and 1940. And again, his amazing book, it's called Nationalism, A World History. Dr. Storm, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
Well, Dr. Storm, it's such an honor to have you on our show. I want to get started. I have to say, as we mentioned before taping the show, that we're living in the age where politics are getting more and more complicated, and economy also standing at the crossroads. But based on your book, especially getting to the introduction of the book that you wrote, that most people argue their nation's identity and interest should be protected against globalization, immigration, and assertive minorities. Professor Storm, help us with better understanding. When we understand the word globalization today, how do we define the concept of nationalism? Do those two terms go hand in hand with each other? Your thoughts?
Well, I think the relationship between globalization and nationalism is quite complex. So normally we understand that globalization connects people, that there is more trade, more travel, more tourism. Through the internet, it's more easy to communicate with other people around the world. But like with the internet, we thought initially that it would lead to a global village, a kind of very pleasant marketplace where people from around the world meet and have friendly discussions. But we all know that internet and especially social media maybe had the opposite effect. So it caused polarization, it strengthened national identities, and this is something we also see in the real world. So that globalization stimulates countries to distinguish themselves from each other. So countries are forced to become a brand, to attract investments, to attract tourists, and to attract talents as well. So in a sense, globalization causes countries to put more emphasis on their unique national identity or their unique selling point. So in a sense, national identities have become stronger and gotten more attention and more emphasis over the last few decades. And so the relationship is complex. On the other hand, the way countries do it, the branding process, is very similar. So everybody does it the same way, emphasizing specific aspects of their own national identity that supposedly are unique. So this is one relationship. I think there is another aspect maybe to it, the rise of right-wing or radical right-wing populism, that there is a kind of uncertainty, economic instability, and anxiety as well, that people hope to find a kind of a community or a kind of existential certainty or base in their national identity. So we see that populists around the world focus very much on their national identity and nationalism as the main political ideology as well.
Professor Storm, when we look at, again, going back to your book, couple significant leaders that you mentioned in the book, for example, Viktor Orban in Hungary in 2010, Narendra Modi, India, 2014, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, 2016, and of course, the elephant in the room, Donald Trump in 2025. Now, when we look at all those leaders, especially Donald Trump, correct me if I'm wrong, that back in 2016, for the first time that he ran as the presidential candidate, I believe he ran on the platform to restore the national identity or even to restore the concept of nationalism. So when we look at the political field, Dr. Storm, you're the expert. What kind of message do we believe that people like Donald Trump, like Viktor Orban, Narendra Modi, or Rodrigo Duterte have something in common when we talk about nationalism? So in other words, too often when we interpret nationalism, I guess on one hand, we understand it's a complicated concept, but on the other hand, average voters tend to interpret it as patriotism. So in other words, the total devotion to the country or the total dedication, faithfulness to the administration or to the policies or regulations. But again, 2025, we're seeing something different as we continue to unwrap the political game. So going back to my question, what kind of message do you think from those leaders that really resonates with the voters when it comes to nationalism? And are we seeing any changes in 2025?
Yes. So what all these leaders have in common, and there are many more, Milei in Argentina or Bolsonaro in Brazil or many populist leaders in Europe as well, is that they argue that they put their nation first. And this means that they're very anti-immigrants. So especially refugees or illegal immigrants should be expelled or held at the border, that their economic interests should be first, that they also put a lot of emphasis on traditional values, which mostly are values of heterosexual family, traditional family, but also of the majority groups in the population, which I think is very clear in the United States as well. And in India as well, the Modi is a clear Hindu nationalist, so not all people in India are Hindus, but he really argues that Hindu really is the core. The Hindus are the core group of India, and India should be a Hindu nation. So we see a lot of similarities. But I think what they argue that they are patriots, but I think what we now see very clearly with the new Trump administration is that he puts U.S. interest over the interest of other countries. So which means that he's now putting tariffs on neighboring countries, Canada, Mexico, but and all of them are allies. And so a lot of the way he treats Ukraine as well, we have seen all the scenes in the Oval Office with Zelensky. So he's really kind of bullying small countries, also wanting to annex the Panama Canal or Greenland. So smaller countries are kind of treated as vassal states almost, or territories that can be occupied at will. And I think so Trump, in a sense, and in a way, he's following Vladimir Putin in this way is uh, more operating as an empire rather than a nation state. So he justifies his imperial policies by arguing America first, um, but not really respecting a world of more or less equal nation states and an international order based on rules and international law. So it's still not very clear how this will play out, because he argues that he wants Greenland, but he does not yet have taken a real significant step. But what we see is a kind of return of empire, and this is also very clear in the case of Russia that invaded Ukraine and seems to have ambitions to really be the major power in the former Soviet space. Um, so we see really, yeah, developments that that profoundly can profoundly transform the existing order of international order.
You know, Dr. Storm, when we talk about international order, especially we're seeing this political transformation around the world, that really brings us to the next topic. Again, something that you also mentioned in your book is what we called territorial identities. I mean, when we talk about nationalism, this is something that you wrote, and I quote, the growing strength of the state also had impact on the way territorial identities were formulated. I mean, again, going back, look at the war in Ukraine, for example. It's beyond this territorial dispute. And also, we're looking at other major conflict around the world. The conversation shall be different. But, Professor, from your perspective, why do you think it's important and also crucial for us to understand the concept of territorial identities when we look at nationalism? So in other words, I love, I mean, it's not me, but anyone or any person loves the country so much that refuse to give up any land or refuse to give up any portion of the country to anyone else, regardless what methodology or measures the opponent could take. So I think today we are getting a bit more confused when we look at territorial dispute or territorial identities when we talk about nationalism. So can you help us? What is the relationship between those two?
I think there is this difficulty of what is a nation. So this is even more difficult because in English, nation is also used as a synonym for country, and so I think we should distinguish between state or country and the nation as a group of people. So there are a lot of nations in the world without a state. So think of the Catalans or the Kurds or the Karen, um, or maybe also the First Nations in the United States. So there are about, we tend to think of a nation as a cohesive cultural group with one language, but there are about 7,000 living languages in the world. So the number of potential nations is much larger than the number of nation states. There are only 200 states in the world. And so what happens is that having a state means that you have a lot of power. So you can have your own education system, you can produce maps, you have your military, you can have impact on the language spoken. And so this also means that national identities are mostly connected more strongly to nation states rather than to nations without a state. So for a Kurd, it's much more difficult to define and also to implement their ideas about their territorial identities than it is for a country like the United States or Canada or the Netherlands, where I live. And so what happened over the last 2 centuries is that nationalism really was a kind of new ideology. So it is an ideology that argues that the state should serve the nation, and so that the state is not there anymore to serve an all-powerful king or emperor that has received its power from above. So the by the grace of God, the former kings governed, or the mandate of heaven in the case of the Chinese emperor. It's now the other way around. The state should serve the nation. And so this ideology has been extremely powerful, not just from above by state officials, but also by a lot of intellectuals that stimulated, that wrote national histories. And so nationalism now has infused the world of culture. So we have national literatures, we have national painting schools, we have national types of architecture, and even food has been nationalized. So we now have all kind of Mexican cuisine, Chinese cuisine, French cuisine, but this is a product of the late 19th century. So what basically happened is that local dishes or dishes connected to specific rituals or specific social groups became part of a national cuisine. And so cookbooks became national cookbooks. And so also nature has been nationalized. So when in the second half of the 19th century in the United States, activists wanted to protect beautiful nature, they decided to turn it into a park and they named it a national park. So it became patrimony of the nation. So these territorial identities have been strengthened, and the national territorial identity is much stronger in most cases than local or regional or transnational identities. So this really also gives a kind of image that the nation and the nation state can be taken for granted because its identity is visible in food, it's visible in nature, in history, it's all around. So the entire world has been nationalized right now. So therefore, for populists like Trump, it is also very easy to appeal to these national identities because these national identities over the last 200 years have really been constructed and have gotten a lot of substance.
Two more questions before letting you go, Dr. Storm. Now, I want to talk about the next part is the nationalization of culture. I mean, again, I don't want to use US as the example all the time, but when we look at the news headline from the battle against cancel culture, all the way to Donald Trump within the first 100 days signed executive orders over gender identity, over language identity. And especially today, we're looking at this, what he called education chaos. I mean, again, putting everything together, that still dance around the concept of culture. So from your perspective, Dr. Storm, how do we understand the link between nationalism and culture? And because, again, without mentioning politics, it's not just about which party wins the White House. It's not just about which party can get the things done more effectively. I think it's the message that crossed the nation. The message truly resonates with the voters. So do you think that nationalism today, it's serving as a motivator to push the social agenda, or even perhaps vice versa, that because we're seeing the cultural changes, we would begin to see the elevation of nationalism across the spectrum? What do you say to that?
Yeah, well, it's very clear that these culture wars do exist, and they are also promoted very much by many politicians because it is clear that voters, it really touches upon the electorate,
Mm.
and they. But on the other hand, state power is mostly about money. So they have an enormous budget. They divide the budget. They can also give more money to the poor, or tax cuts for the rich. So there's also and but this discussion is largely pushed aside by these culture wars. And the interesting thing is that this emphasis on culture and on national identity arose simultaneously by the last phase of globalization. So it's really the end of the 1970s, with the rise of neoliberal policies, that we see a new wave of globalization, and also a new wave of emphasis on national identity. So Ronald Reagan, for instance, really portrayed himself as a patriot, and he focused on traditional family values. And this is something that we see around the world. But it's also very interesting to see what happened in the decades after the Second World War.
Mm.
Because if we look at the 1950s and 60s, it is the time of decolonization. So nationalism was very prominent. But what we see is that modernization was much more important. So all these new countries, and also the older countries, wanted to rebuild, to reconstruct their countries, to focus on economic progress, and modernize their countries. So the infrastructure, everywhere we see the same high-rise buildings, big engineering projects like the Volta Dam in Ghana, or the Aswan Dam in Egypt. It's the time of the Green Revolution as well. So the large-scale agriculture, it should be efficient, and all kind of traditional buildings and cultivation methods disappeared. So the world became much more similar in the 1950s and 60s, because there was this strong focus on modernity, working towards a better future. And so only towards the end of the 1970s, with the rise of neoliberalism, we get a shift towards identity. Where do we come from? What are our traditions? What is so much more nostalgic and backward looking attitude, in a sense, and a kind of wanting to return to a kind of idealized past that probably never existed. And so national identity has become extremely important right now, and it really strikes a chord with the voters. But as we can also see, it's probably also a kind of mechanism to lead the focus away from economic issues, on which the government has much more to say, and to have all these discussion on identity issues, on these culture wars. And so nobody speaks about the major tax breaks that they want to give to the rich, as Donald Trump wants in the United States, and many other populists. They argue that they are there for the best interest of the people, but in general, it's a small elite of business owners, and often also their personal friends and family members, that are the ones who are favored by tax breaks and getting nice business deals with the government. So you could also look at it from an economic and social angle, and then one could even say, well, it's maybe a conspiracy to steal from the poor and give it to the rich. So maybe that's a bit strong to say, but maybe one could argue that this will be the case in the United States.
Dr. Storm, I want to ask you the last question. Again, going back to your book, it's called Nationalism, a world history. I always ask each guest the same question. For anyone who is not familiar with nationalism, who is not very much familiar with the history of nationalism, what would you expect the readers to understand? Or what would you expect the readers to take away? Not as a political scientist, not as a professor in academia, but as an average citizen who is genuinely interested in participating the movement, hoping that positive changes can still bring effective results. So I want to hear your final thoughts. What are your takeaways and what are your expectations from the readers? Your final thoughts.
Yeah, well, as a historian, what we do is look critically at the past. And what I try to do in the book is to show that both the nation and national identity, but also nation states, are quite recent inventions. So for us historians, 200 years is well, a very small part of the history of humanity. And so the nation and the nation state is not much older than 200 years, well, 250 maybe. So it's a very recent invention. And nonetheless, we really tend to take it for granted that nations are something real, that they do exist, and that it's normal to take them for granted, and that it is also logical to appeal to national identity, to protect it, to take it into account, and that a world consisting of more or less equal nation states, each with their own unique culture, is something that is out there and that is real. But also with this global approach, I show that the way the nation state and these national identities were created really was a global process, so that there are a lot of similarities, and that all these nationalists are basically doing the same thing all around the world. And so that it helps the reader to look critically at and not take for granted the world as it exists today, and also be more critical about what they think is their national identity. It's a construction, and it's a human construction. And so this also means that we as humans, we can reconstruct it or take a new direction, especially seeing the global climate crisis that is currently going on and will only get worse. I think we should also go beyond the nation state and beyond our national interest and look what is the interest of humanities and what is the interest of the entire world if we want to survive and avoid major natural disasters that really can harm everyone. So I think my book, the aim of my book, is to make people aware, to relativize nationalism and ideas about national identity, and my hope is that people from all different parts of the globe come together and really be more understanding to each other.
Well, Dr. Storm, that is the message for the entire international community. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such a great honor to speak to Dr. Eric Storm, and I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out his amazing book, which is called Nationalism, A World History. Professor Storm, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes as we continue to pay attention that matters around the world. So thank you so much for doing this.